I want to go to Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Immediately afterward, he compelled the disciples to get in the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. While he sent the crowds away, after he had sent the crowd away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone, but the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. If we're not careful, fear can cause us to miss what God's doing. Just a little side note there. Starting back on verse 27. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter responded and said to him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened and he began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out with his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got in the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are truly God's Son." Now Peter getting out of the boat definitely took faith. It was a big step of faith. Jesus gave him direction, and Peter stepped out in faith with his eyes fixed on Jesus. And then what happened? What happened is what typically happens when God is moving, and that's distraction. The wind blew, and Peter lost focus. He became afraid. His trust began to waver, and he began to sink. But Jesus, proving his faithfulness, once again, he pulls Peter up to safety, and he says to him, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" You know, I looked up that portion of scripture in the Strong's Concordance, and when it says "of little faith" there, in that particular scripture, it means lacking confidence. Peter began lacking confidence that he could do what the Lord had asked him to do. He lacked confidence, and he began to sink. How many times do we find ourselves beginning to lack confidence in the path God has us on? How often do we let our trust in the pilot's ability to get us safely from point A to point B waver? Now, we know God doesn't hold it against his children when we come short in following his directions and guidance, but there are consequences. In Peter's case, that consequence was he began to sink. And thank God that he's merciful and good, so that when Peter sank, he picked him up, and when we fall, he picks us back up. Jesus picked him back up, and they walked back to the boat together. You know, I can't help but think that those moments when we lose confidence, when we begin to sink, and God has to pick us back up and help us get back on track, do those moments cause delays in the trip? Remember I mentioned earlier, a straight path is typically faster than taking detours, taking a bunch of twists and turns. As I was preparing for this message, I had the thought, we often get impatient and frustrated with God when we're waiting to see his plans manifested in our lives. But is he really the one causing the delay? No. Is it really God's fault if I decide to circle the same mountain 43 times before I work up the courage to go up it? I don't think it is. How often do we have a word of instruction from the Lord and have to mull it over for weeks before we decide to do something with it? We've been studying the book of Hebrews in Thursday night Bible study. And a couple weeks ago, John made the comment that we need to get a point in our spiritual maturity where we immediately can discern whether something is and is not of God. He's right, we do. We need to get to that. We need to get to that point that where we immediately know and are confident in that knowledge. So confident that we can act accordingly without any hesitation.